Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'd like to thank you for joining today's ADHD experts presentation titled Genes and the Environment: How Biology and Exposures Contribute to ADHD in Children. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Joel Nigg. Dr. Nigg is the director of the Center for ADHD Research at Oregon Health and Science University and vice chair for psychology in the Department of Psychiatry. He's a leading researcher in the field of ADHD and the author of more than 200 scientific papers related to the neuropsychological, cognitive, and temperamental correlates of childhood ADHD, to ADHD genetics, to ADHD environmental risks, and to brain development in ADHD. He's the author of Getting Ahead of ADHD, a book for parents that addresses standard and non-standard treatments and lifestyle and environmental modification approaches to ADHD. He also maintains a blog via Psychology Today. In today's webinar, we will discuss risk factors for ADHD. As you know, evidence suggests that ADHD is hereditary, but a growing body of research also points to environmental influences like stress, trauma, and toxins. Today, we'll discuss those and many others, their impact on the developing brain, and offer some actionable steps to maximize healthy development for children with ADHD. To kick off, we have a poll question for our live audience. We would like to know which lifestyle change or treatment option has improved your child's ADHD-associated learning and/or behavior challenges the most. Please select your answers, and you can comment in the text box below to tell us more. You'll see the results when you submit your response, and this will help us in the Q&A section to make sure we're getting your questions answered. So while you do that, a few notes. To download today's slides, click on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. If you're interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in an email about an hour after we wrap up the live broadcast. Also, a transcript of today's events will be made available in the coming week. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 433 to access the slides, the webinar replay, the certificate of attendance option, and the webinar transcript. For the holiday season, ADDitude Magazine is offering a 2-for-1 subscription deal now through December 31st. Visit ADDitudemag.com and navigate to the magazine section and then gift subscription to get these savings till the end of the year. Finally, the sponsor of today's webinar is Inflow. Inflow is the #1 app to help you manage your ADHD. Developed by leading clinicians, Inflow is a science-based self-help program based on the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. Click the link on the screen to download it now, or in the Apple Store or Google Play Store. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Joel Nigg. Dr. Nigg, thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this really interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Annie, and thanks everyone for your interest in this. In today's remarks, my plan is to spend about half the time giving you some science, kind of explaining how genes and environments work in ADHD to give you some necessary background for context and thinking about this. And then I'll run through some of what we know about environmental risks as part of that. But I also will save some time at the end to go through kind of practical, so what can I do now as a caregiver items to give some suggestions for starting that discussion to help you. Some of the material here is from my 2017 book, Getting Ahead of ADHD. So I want to disclose that I do get royalties for that. I'm not here to advertise that book, but just want to be transparent about that. I have updated some of the material for this slideshow. So if the information is different here than in there, it's because the information here is more up to date. No other industry sponsorships. All my research is supported by unrestricted grant or philanthropic funds. And first thing I want to point out is that there was a time about 30 years ago when many scientists and general public thought that when the gene revolution started, that we would find a gene for ADHD, the gene for bipolar disorder, the gene for autism, and so on. That is clearly wrong. We now know after 25 to 30 years of extensive genetic research. Lots of genes are involved in these conditions. There's lots of overlap in those genes, lots of genetic correlations. And we also know that genes don't explain the whole story for any of these conditions, despite some fairly substantial genetic influence, all of them. As part of this, the old nature-nurture debate is dead. It's now recognized that from a biological perspective, genes and environments work together to shape development of the brain and behavior throughout life, especially in early life, but also throughout life. I don't mean to undercut the importance of genetics. They are very important, but we will see some significant limitations on genetic influence as well. This is simply a summary of almost 30 studies, just to tell us that we know from twin studies that ADHD is heritable. That doesn't mean it's always inherited. It means that when you look at variation between people, all the people in this audience, who has more ADHD symptoms than somebody else, 75% of that variation is due to genetic variation. The other 25% is due to non-genetic causes. However, even the genetic variation can mask environmental effects. Gene-environment interactions can show up as heritability, and so can certain kinds of gene and environment correlations. So I'll say more about those interactions and correlations. They can actually be even more important than is indicated by the 75% genetic statistic. And the reality is we don't actually know to what extent the environment is affecting ADHD. When we look at biological genetic data, what we see is that a lot of the statistical heritability is not explained by the genetic measurements we have. Some of that has to be gene-environment interactions. We also know that genes are important. There was a question in the Q&A list starting out about this recent evidence of gene expression in the brain of people who died that had ADHD. This is work done by my colleague Philip Shaw and his team at NIMH. And this simply point of this slide is indeed we do see important genetic correlates to ADHD everywhere we look. Just to underscore again the point that genes do matter for ADHD, however, they aren't the whole story. Why not? For one thing, as I'll explain, if we look at mental disorders, they don't behave like single gene metabolic disease, and that'll become very clear in a second. Number two, as I mentioned, environment effects can be hidden in all these heritability terms. Even the gene expression data that I just showed you could have been due to environmental effects, because environments can change gene expression. If you are emotionally traumatized or eat a different diet, your genes recognize that and their gene expression changes. And the biological mechanisms for how that happens are increasingly being understood and demonstrated in animals and insects, and slowly but surely in humans. So gene effects are not hardwired. They depend on gene expression. Environments can influence those. How much they influence them for ADHD is an open question. So we now know it's nature and nurture for complex conditions and traits like ADHD. Let me just go back a minute to this question. This is an example of twin data. And I want to kind of show you what seems at first like a surprising puzzle. You can see in the blue and red here on the left that twin concordance for ADHD is very high if the twins are identical twins, 60 to 70% agreement on ADHD symptoms for identical twins. When you move to the right-hand side of the chart with the blue and the red, you see there that the non-identical twin concordance, fraternal concordance, just regular sibling concordance in effect, is only about half that. That's why we know that there's a substantial genetic influence on ADHD. However, what may surprise you and surprised me when I first learned it decades ago, the data are quite similar for infectious diseases. Here I've got the examples of tuberculosis and the leprosy, and you can see that here too, identical twins are very similar compared to non-identical twins. And clearly, the leprosy or tuberculosis is not being inherited. It was once believed that it was inherited at one time because it runs in families, but obviously these are caused by bacteria, but they don't affect everyone the same. They affect people differently depending on your genotype. The same is true of COVID, the common cold, and every other infectious disease to varying extents. Now, there is a caveat here. Identical twins do spend more time in each other's presence than non-identical twins, and so there does require some careful thinking about these type of data, but there are review papers that I've cited here at the bottom of the slide that carefully work through that and demonstrate still genetic influence. And if you look at the genetic influences on, say, tuberculosis in the medical literature, you'll see quite an active literature, very similar to the ADHD and psychiatry literature, because genetic liability is a major factor here. So what is this genetic liability and how does it work is an open question, but we know that it depends in part on the environment for its activation. Nothing as simple as an infection for ADHD, unfortunately, but a complex mix of many environments work together to enhance or activate genetic liability or genetic propensity. Let me also just briefly outline why we know it's not a single gene disorder just from looking at the condition. So we have two kinds of gene effects. We have single gene disorders, example is Huntington's disease, and we have complex diseases like diabetes, hypertension, psychiatric conditions. The role of genes is deterministic versus probable. You can tell epidemiologically, single gene disorders are very rare, complex diseases are common, and to see the same thing in family, sibling risk only slightly increased. Identical twin concordance, far less than 100%. So we view ADHD now as a susceptibility model or a liability model. The heritability or genetic effect is strong, but it's not determinative. Which environments do we look at is an important question, and one that is debated heavily in the scientific community, and obviously the field is vast for what we might look at. Clearly, we hear a lot about general distress on families, distress on civilization. I put this, may seem a little tongue-in-cheek, collapse of civilization. I know many people feel like we're seeing the collapse of civilization with so many crises going on in our society right now. But it's a real effect when there's economic distress on families or psychological distress on families. We see significant increases in mental health problems after public traumas like hurricanes or terrorist attacks. And we're seeing that with COVID, significant increases in psychological distress and mental illness, depression, even psychosis going up. And this lasts for a long time. So these are real effects when there are major stressors on the society. Pharmaceutical marketing has been written about by many people as a concern that we're artificially inflating this. Performance pressures on children starting school too young. These may be factors as well in why some children present with ADHD, but they are probably only a small part of the story. There's a big concern. I know many of you had questions and concerns about this going into this webinar about, am I causing the problem? Is it my fault as a parent? Is it bad teachers? Certainly, I think people who have not had a lot of experience with ADHD are eager to point to bad parents or bad teachers. And I'll say more about that later, but I'll tip my hand by saying that the answer is no, it's not, didn't come from bad parenting or bad teachers. It is true that teachers and parents often behave in ways that they probably shouldn't with these children. I will say that that's easy to do and very normal because kids with ADHD are difficult to manage. And so negative dynamics do occur, and that is something I will talk about a little bit later, but it's not where the problem starts. It starts with child temperament and child biology and child exposures earlier in life. And then there's a range of other possibilities here, rare events like alcohol exposure in pregnancy, microischemias, early neural injuries, as well as these widespread concerns about screen media, poor diet, toxic pollutants, again, items that many of you had questions about coming into the webinar that I will offer some updates on here in a minute. So environmental risks and causes. Let's run through some of what we know. What I'm going to preface this by saying there's a large number of risk factors that have been associated with ADHD. The list is rather daunting, and you'll see reading it that it would be impossible to avoid all these risk factors. And so right away, let's relieve ourselves of the belief that we could. So these exposures are inevitable in our society to some extent. And that has to be part of what we recognize is how can we compensate for these exposures when children are genetically vulnerable to being responsive. Not all kids respond to these risks, but some do, and that's part of where ADHD and other health problems, mental health and physical health problems, can come from. I also want to point out right now that many of these risk factors I'm going to list off, we don't know if they have a causal effect or if it's just artificial due to unmeasured correlates. I'll focus on that in a minute. But let me run through some of what we know. I also want to say that the evidence, it varies from very strong to a maybe for some of these risk factors. But we know that fetal alcohol syndrome or excessive alcohol exposure in pregnancy can cause an ADHD-like syndrome. It's not identical to ADHD, but very similar. There is a fairly rare condition called PANDAS, which comes from typically a strep infection in early life, but it can be other kinds of infections that occasionally will trigger tics, OCD behaviors, and ADHD-like behaviors in children. This is distinguishable from ADHD because it onsets suddenly after an infection, and because you see tics and OCD behaviors, obsessive compulsive behaviors, as leading indicators, not just ADHD. But I have had questions from parents about this. Could this strep infection have led to ADHD? It's conceivable, depending on the timing and the other symptom profiles. Smoking in pregnancy is a major correlate of ADHD, but probably not causal. Looks like when parents with ADHD tend to smoke more, and that this is probably a genetic effect masquerading as a smoking effect. For other drugs and medications, there's mixed evidence. I'll say more about a couple of those in a minute. We know that lead exposure, if it's high, can trigger hyperactivity. That's been a concern for 30 or 40, 50 years, and as part of why lead restrictions have come online. But now we're learning that even very low levels of exposure have an effect on ADHD. And then very low birth weight and probably prematurity as well can lead to an ADHD syndrome. Again, none of these are specific to ADHD. Other outcomes besides ADHD can occur, other health outcomes as well. I'll say a little more about this in a minute. Another feature is maternal metabolic syndrome. There's a substantial association of maternal metabolic health. These are symptoms like obesity, hypertension, and so on in mothers are associated with increased inflammation in the offspring, in the fetus, and this inflammation can affect the brain. We're still learning more about how this works. In fact, it's a major focus of our research in our ADHD center at OHSU, is to understand this better, given that overweight and obesity are so difficult to avoid in our society. And again, I say this not to induce guilt, because we also know that many children from obese parents have no health problems at all. So clearly this is not a major effect, but it is an effect that's helping us learn about mechanisms. For all these effects, each of the effects are fairly small in isolation. They're not the whole cause. They're not a sole explanation. Maternal exposure to stress or trauma, if it's high, can influence offspring behavior and temperament. Delivery complications are a major one for a lot of this. We see kids who've had oxygen deprivation at birth or distress at birth and then show up with some attentional symptoms later. Low birth weight, as I mentioned, is well established. Risk factor that appears to probably have a significant causal influence in those cases. So there is a subset of ADHD cases that are coming just from very low or low birth weight. Delivery, premature birth, similarly is emerging as even when birth weight wasn't low, if it's too premature, I'm not talking about a couple weeks, but significantly premature, can have an effect. So there's quite a lot of interest in the maternal health and delivery health here. And again, I know this can be a source of regret and second guessing for parents. I understand and sympathize with that. I encourage those of you who've been through this not to get too troubled by it because, again, the majority of kids with these experiences don't develop ADHD. There still has to be some other vulnerability or some other factors combined with these things in order for ADHD to emerge. These are not all by themselves the entire explanation in general. If you have a very significant deoxygenation injury at birth, that may be the story, but even then, some children will have that same effect and not have ADHD. You still have the genetic liability going with it. After the child is born, there are other environments that can have effects and be ongoing, which opens the door to some protective things that parents can do that I'll talk about. Sleep problems, surprisingly common. Most children with ADHD have some kind of behavioral sleep problem. Problems going to bed, problems staying in bed, problems staying asleep, contentious bedtimes, leading to a vicious cycle of poor sleep and worse attention. This gets particularly significant as children get older into the teenage years and their own sleep cycle conflicts with the school schedule. Endogenous sleep disorders are also slightly elevated in ADHD, but still not the majority of cases. But there are treatments that are very effective. Counseling treatments are very effective for sleep problems that can be addressed. Nutrition effects are emerging increasingly, where we see kids with ADHD have lower vitamin D or lower omega-3 or lower ferritin, or are exposed to excessive synthetic food dyes. Again, each of these, there are food allergens, food sensitivities. Again, each of these effects is very small in and of itself, not enough to explain your child's ADHD. What we think happens is these all add up over time. It's kind of like asthma. Multiple exposures accumulate until it goes over the top and the child begins to exhibit problematic symptoms of inattention, behavior, emotional dysregulation, and other difficulties. Toxicant exposures, many of you asked about this. They are a concern. Lead levels, even at the levels that are average in our population. The United States has one of the lowest average lead levels in the world due to our excellent environmental protection laws on lead that have been established over the last 40 years. But even so, the lead is still there. Lead stays a long time. When we looked at lead levels in 300 children, just from the general population, of whom half had ADHD, all of them had detectable lead levels in their blood, even though those levels are within the quote-unquote safe level, and those effects are related to their ADHD. I'm going to come back to that special case in a minute because we know a lot about lead. But other kinds of air pollution are starting to raise concerns. Nitrous dioxide appears to be correlated, although it's still unclear. Persistent organic pollutants, and so on. So there's lots of evidence for pollutants to be correlated with ADHD. We don't know for a lot of these whether they're causal. And I'll again come back to that question of was it really causal or just a correlate. Closed head injury, traumatic brain injury can certainly create a very ADHD mimic syndrome. And this is complicated by the fact that kids with ADHD are more prone to have head injuries. So that makes it very much of a chicken and egg question when you've got ADHD and a head injury. But one reason that ADHD concerns us as clinicians is that these children are twice or three times as likely to obtain serious head injuries, accidental head injuries through their impulsivity. We know that early neglect, traumatic abuse, or psychological trauma can mimic ADHD. These are usually distinguishable for an expert clinician in an evaluation to know if you're really dealing with a trauma effect or ADHD. However, again, you could have both. Chicken and the egg. Kids with ADHD are more likely to have emotional trauma, more likely to have accidents. And so the clinical evaluation is really to carefully evaluate this. And that is important because what you're going to do for treatment is going to be somewhat different if you're dealing with a head injury effect or an emotional trauma effect versus really the main thing here is ADHD and the other factors are small in this case, then your treatment is different. So these, even though these are past events, their role does matter a lot in deciding what the treatment is. And so getting your evaluation and sorting this out with a professional expert is very valuable. And again, if trauma happens, kids with ADHD are more reactive, more sensitive here, and need extra support. And that's something to be aware of when there is a major event that the family experiences, or right now that society, again, COVID, we see kids with ADHD having more trouble than other kids for this reason in response to the many disruptions we've had the last few years. Now, important factors here that I want to point out. First, these are not randomly distributed risks. They add up, they co-occur, they come together in clusters. Therefore, it's hard to isolate them and know which is really having the effect. Each effect is small, they add up. They are worse in disadvantaged populations, so those who have economic disadvantage, social disadvantage have more risk factors, and that compounds the risk and the problem and makes it, again, more difficult to isolate the factors. And I clearly have laid a lot, the data, the science tends to lay a lot on mothers in terms of, prenatal health. Well, fathers are not off the hook. We're learning more and more about the fact that paternal exposures pre-pregnancy affect sperm health and affect fetal health later. So paternal exposures pre-pregnancy can affect the child, just like maternal exposures pre-pregnancy can. This is a really dramatic new direction in medical health and psychiatric health research about the very early origins of developmental risks. And so this is relevant for those planning to have children to really look to your diet, your stress, your chemical exposures, and so on, even before conception, as it may, again, this is still really an emerging area, but and most of the literature is still on non-human species to look at this, but the new data coming out are quite intriguing and really open up new areas for interest. Also, partners and fathers are extremely important in terms of social support and helping with that maternal prenatal health. This is a family factor. So again, we don't want to isolate the mothers here. The history of psychiatry has seen plenty of blaming of mothers over the past 100 years. I do not want to see that return. I think many of the stresses that mothers go through when they're pregnant are unavoidable and inevitable, and the baby is very resilient, and most babies weather these stresses fine. The few that have genetic vulnerability are going to show sensitivity to it, and that is what we're looking at with ADHD. The big elephant in the room, though, concerns, are these factors causal? We know for dietary effects they are, because we can do direct experiments on diet ethically, but we can't ethically look at lead exposure or air pollution exposure or trauma exposure, so we have to infer indirectly. Most studies of the environment are that we rely on for these studies are large population studies from Scandinavia. They do not consider genetic effects, and also the Scandinavian population is very different than the American population. So the actual effect in our communities is still unclear for a lot of these environments. That's a major caveat. Secondly, when genetic effects are considered, some of these effects might go away. For example, it looks like with smoking that it's because there's an association of smoking and ADHD in the parents, and the smoking itself didn't cause the baby to have ADHD. The baby was going to have ADHD anyway. Smoking might have caused other health problems for the baby, respiratory problems or asthma, but not ADHD. And so to what extent this baby was going to have ADHD, even if you had avoided these risk factors, remains a possibility for you to be aware of it, especially in terms of alleviating guilt. The other possibility here, though, is genetic nurturance. Maybe parents with ADHD also have worse diets or are more sensitive to their child. In fact, both of these are probably true. But for the child, these are environmental effects, even though they're coming from genetic environment correlations. So sorting out whether it was really an environmental effect or genetic effect, a little bit depends on the specific process of the specific dynamic that we look at. So I've mentioned all this only for you to appreciate the complexity here of really teasing this out, and the science really being still in progress of terms of understanding these effects. I really want to avoid you coming away here with a simplistic yes or no answer on these things, and to understand the complexities and the nuances here are still emerging. Nonetheless, we have some good steps we can take that I'll come to in a minute. I do want to quickly race through here, and these slides will be made available to you to go back and review. We can evaluate causality indirectly. There are methods that have been identified in science. One of the most powerful is to use genetics, and this is called Mendelian randomization. The idea here is simply that we can look at random genetic mutations that are random, but change the biology of alcohol use, or the biology of toxicant handling, or the biology of lead handling, And because these effects are randomly distributed in the population, we get a natural experiment here. We can stratify by the gene in the population and then see if that effect is there. And if it is, it's like an experiment, and it shows that it's causal. And we do see that for ADHD. We did this experiment for lead, and we can see that the effect of lead on ADHD is far stronger with one genotype than the other. This is the demonstration both of gene-environment interaction and of causality here. And so that's the kind of thing we can do to start to establish causality. Same has been done for food additives. And so I want to summarize what we know here. So some things we know do have a causal effect. Lead, food dyes, omega-3 supplementation, as well as omega-3 shortfall in the blood, low birth weight. On the other hand, social disadvantage, we have no idea what the causal role is there. Breastfeeding looks like it's probably not causal from a study that we did, even though less breastfeeding is associated with more ADHD, but that's probably not a causal. It's probably backwards causality, where kids who are going to have ADHD are harder to breastfeed. So we're still learning what's causal and what's not. And again, the causal role here is not that this is the whole cause. It's one piece of the cause, along with other causes that accumulate, genetic and non-genetic. So I want to get into, excuse me, some of what we can do about it. Stress, some definitions. There's negative stress, there's positive stress, there's traumatogenic context, like it's ongoing, as well as frank trauma event here. And again, these slides will be available. I'm moving kind of quickly so I can get to some of your action steps and questions. Negative stress is the real factor for ADHD. They're more likely to experience stress, though most do not, more likely to develop PTSD if they do experience a traumatic event, less prepared to cope. And so we get a triple risk there. The same is kind of true for gaming. Here, the data are less clear, though. We don't know the strength of effects. This is a brand new area to what extent social media are having an effect on ADHD. We do see some probable effects emerging. These are preliminary, but they are warning shots for us as parents to be attentive to the potential effects of gaming. There's quite a bit of evidence linking violent content with increased aggression in vulnerable children. Example, kids with ADHD. Social media excessive use, how is that defined? Remains a question mark. Seems to be associated with negative mood and depression in children, especially adolescents, especially girls. But again, we don't know the causal direction. Is this because depressed kids use social media more? That experiments are still being done. Does total screen use contribute to inattention? Maybe a little, not a major factor, actually. It's more of a factor for social development. It can increase the risks of exposure to negative socialization, negative peer interactions, and it can also displace other positive effects. The idea of gaming addiction is a common question. Can gaming actually become an addiction? Many people think it can. This is an area that's receiving increased scientific scrutiny and prioritization at NIMH and in the fields of psychiatry and psychology. Stay tuned for, I think, what are going to be some very helpful studies on addiction and gaming in the next couple of years as this gets much more scrutiny, much more funding to understand it. Preliminary effects suggest this can happen and truly be like an addiction that requires addiction-like management. But I would say that ultimately, again, the magnitude of this is still emerging, but certainly if it does occur, kids with ADHD are vulnerable to this because of their weak control of their attention and the ease with which their attention is captured by highly rewarding, frequent response experiences such as is provided by social media and gaming. All right, does parenting cause ADHD? No. This can be done by randomized trials. You can swap teachers in and out of classrooms, swap kids in and out of classrooms. You can swap parents in and out of rooms with kids, etc. And you can see by experimental control that the behavior of the adult is affected heavily by the behavior of the child. And so that parents who seem to be doing poor behavior with their own kids with ADHD do fine when you put them with kids who don't have ADHD. Teachers who seem to do badly with a child with ADHD do fine with other children. It's that the child does behaviors that are overwhelm the parenting or teacher's skills and lead to a negative dynamic. That can cause the problem to worsen, but it is not where the problem starts. The one exception is in very early life. We really don't know in the first 6 or 8 months of life what parenting effects have on the development of attention and self-control. That's a wide open area that we're actively studying. But for about 4 or 5 years of age and above where this has been studied, we kind of know the picture. Parents can get caught in negative loops, and believe me, as a parent, this can happen with any child, whether they have ADHD or not, but it happens more with ADHD kids, and it can make the problem worse. And that's an important point where you can take action and intervene in your own life and stop that process. So I'll come back to that one. First, I want to just show you one piece of data showing that these effects add up. And again, the take-home point, not to belabor the details of this slide, is just data showing you from our work that genetic effects and psychosocial effects, whether it's family effects or whether it's psychosocial effects, add up on top of each other. Whether they multiply, they add up. So it's the accumulation of these different factors that matters. All right, let's get down to what can we do in the last few minutes here before we go to Q&A. There's quite a bit you can do. The first thing I want to say is things that happen in the distant past that are done are done. I strongly advise all parents, all people, don't belabor the past when you can't do anything about it. It's done. Move forward. There's still a lot you can do to move forward positively, and that's the place to put your energy. Regret does not do us a lot of good. Forward hope and forward action is the way to go. And we see that in therapy every time when we can get ourselves and our patients to look forward with hope and positive steps, we can see positive change no matter what the past was. So I'll give that little pep talk, that little philosophical pep talk there ahead of time, but it's a science-based we know from research that what I say is true on that point. I'm not just saying that as a philosopher, but data shows that looking forward hope has a positive effect all by itself. All right. We know from studies of ADHD treatment that the best results come from treatment with medication plus family intervention and counseling. When the parents are counseled, what is it about the counseling that helps the most? It's parents can reduce, we can all reduce our negative behaviors with our kids. Our criticizing the child, giving them negative feedback, or yelling at them. These behaviors, if they're reduced, the meds work better and the effect is stronger. So parent coaching on this, parent counseling on this can be very effective. There are well-established tactics that therapists can do. I know these days it's really hard to get in to see therapists, and there are self-help books that you can get to do this as well. But this is a key step where you have a lot of power. Again, no self-blame. This is normal. It's almost universal with ADHD to get into these negative loops, but you can break out of it, and that can be very successful. So these are the kind of basic actions, basic elements of success here. The concept is to be planning ahead and not be surprised, to already know what you're going to do. The behavior is predictable. You know what's going to happen again. You plan ahead what you're going to do. With a therapist, you can fine-tune your response. The first thing you try may not work. The self-care is very important, and I'll emphasize that over and over again. The more stressed out you are, the more stressed out your child will be, and the more you'll get into a negative cycle. So your own self-care becomes a critical piece of the strategy here. And again, I know we have a high-stress world, and it's very difficult to do this. I don't say it because it's easy. I struggle myself with the self-care and getting that in, but it's critical to try to do that. Food does seem to play a role. Again, not for everybody, not to a large effect, but it can matter, and it's a place where you can do something. And healthy food can quickly compensate for past unhealthy food. One of the very hopeful things we see in our research is that increasing healthy food can overcome even some of these prenatal effects. For example, mothers who had overweight or obesity, very hard to change. Changing that prenatal diet can rescue those effects. And so there's quite a bit of hope for positive solutions here. Don't try to do it all. There's a lot possible here, but here are some fairly straightforward things you can do that we know will be somewhat helpful. Here are some more ambitious things you can do that that can also be helpful. Eliminating added sugar is helpful health-wise. It probably doesn't have a big effect on ADHD, actually. but kids will learn to eat healthy food if it's the only options they have. This is not easy to do, especially if you have a large family or many children who like their food, they're not used to different food. Often have to combine diet changes with a behavior plan with a therapist to help children comply with this. Otherwise, it turns into a battle over food. You don't want to go there and have a war over this. You want to get the children excited about the change, motivated with a behavior plan. That can take some planning and some thinking. However, that said, between 5 and 25% of kids with ADHD will respond positively to sufficient work on the diet and getting rid of allergens, additives, and adding healthy foods. So if you think this is a factor in your child's life, you might be right, and get the counseling and nutritional support you need. Use a nutritionist, a counselor to the extent you need, or medical advice to do it safely, but this can be helpful. Sleep schedule, this is hard to do, again, but very valuable if you can do it. And again, if you're having sleep behavior problems, counseling tactics for this are very effective. Find a counselor who knows how to handle this, or pull out the books that are on this that have tips. It can work, and it can be a big help for kids who are having sleep problems. Exercise, activity, again, a lot of kids with ADHD aren't motivated for this, but if you can get them to do it, or find something they like to do that's active, it's beneficial. So these are some steps that you can do. There's new research that we're doing on therapeutic doses of multinutrients. Annie, I can make that reference available for those that are interested offline to ADDitude readership, and we can work something out to make that available. I think it's a very promising direction that some families might want to consider. And then, as I mentioned, the restriction diets can be helpful in some cases. Toxicant pollutions, hard to avoid, but I recommend here, if you can do it, the EPA website is a good place loaded with information about what you can do to avoid. But it is a concern, again, for vulnerable children, and good HEPA filters are available for the house. Filters of water that will keep lead out are available, and these products are listed on the EPA website or available through some research that can be useful. That's in our family. This is what we do. We've researched and purchased a water filter that filters out lead, and we've got HEPA air filters, HEPA quality air filters that we can use when we suspect air quality concerns. Exercise, just some practical steps here. Again, I know this can be hard to do, but these are the goals that you have, and it can take some experimentation to make it fun and motivating. More details in the book. Again, not to hawk the book, but there's information there. Let me skip back. I skipped a slide here. Stress and trauma. I've seen many parents and families where recognizing your own history of trauma and stress has been neglected, and going back and attending to that with a counselor, self-help group, very valuable. Social supports are critical and irreplaceable here for reducing stress. There are cognitive strategies that therapists can help with that can turn stress into a positive, being a survivor, being tough, overcoming, reframing it as an opportunity. Exercise can actually reverse the biological effects of traumatic events in the body, believe it or not, and that can then help the brain heal and the body heal. So again, there's almost a medicinal benefit to sufficient exercise. Maintaining that calm tone in the home, getting rid of high intensity, very hard, but again, can be done with some counseling and some focus, can be very valuable. Again, getting the correct assessment. Counseling for trauma, the approach for trauma is very different than what you do for ADHD, and it's very important to have that sorted out in a good assessment if in doubt. Technology, the real critical element here is parent involvement. Where we really see problems is when parents have thrown up their hands, given up, let the kids do whatever they want. Stick with it, try to get involved, and create some kind of agreement with your child about how much they're going to use and how to stay safe on the internet and with social media. Trying to stay involved as a parent is the critical piece. So take-home points here. Not a simple thing. Appreciate the complexity and the nuance here. That is genes and environments. Genetic effects are real. It's hard to make these changes. Don't blame yourself if you can't get it right right away on the environment. It's going to be partial. You may always have some tendencies here for ADHD. Not all the risk factors are causal, so before getting too guilty, recognize that many of these, your child may have an ADHD anyway. The risk factor all by itself usually isn't the whole story. On the other hand, the side of hope is that environments do matter and they can make a difference. And even doing a little bit can help because the effects are probably additive. You can't do everything, but the little bit you can do may bring some benefit, even if all you can do is add omega-3 supplements, or all you can do is add some more extensive exercise and activity. Those things alone can bring some degree of help. Parent self-care, parent behavior matters, and so you do have the ability to get some gains here on some of the problematic behaviors. I should stress that things like defiant behavior versus inattention don't all respond the same. So depending what behavior you're concerned about, that's what to focus on in terms of what you do. All right, be kind to yourself, be kind to your child. Don't be guilty. Look forward with hope and optimism, and things can get better. All right, I have saved the rest of the time for discussion, and thank you for your interest, and the slides will be made available.
Wonderful. Dr. Nigg, thank you so much. That was incredibly informative, and we do have a lot of questions. I will very quickly thank Inflow one more time for sponsoring this webinar, and then I will get right into it. Our survey revealed that almost half of you said that stimulant medication was the most helpful in managing your child's learning and behavior challenges associated with ADHD. Number two was, not surprisingly, improved diet, exercise, and sleep. So I wanted to follow up on, you had mentioned targeting perhaps the elimination of 6 allergenic foods. Could you give us just a quick overview of what those are and why we would target those foods?
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to ask that because I was trying to look them up real quick. Let's see if I can get it here. Shellfish, peanuts, eggs, dairy, and there's 2 others, and now I'm drawing a blank. So we'll have to make those available offline. Why don't we, Annie, plan to add them to that slide before we upload the slides for public viewing, and they'll be there.
Right. Okay. We can do that.
But sometimes it's also the food additives, and so it's very hard to identify food sensitivities. But definitely diet, sleep, and exercise are the big 3 for lifestyle change. And it's not surprising that stimulants are half the sample, because the literature certainly shows those effects are the biggest. The advantage of combining lifestyle and stimulants is you may need less stimulants. You may be able to get by on a lower dosage, or go the rest of the way on improvement when stimulants only improve part of the way. But definitely starting to eliminate, these days there's so many good substitutes, at least if you live in a big city, good substitutes for some of these where the taste is just as good. And that's been something we've done in our family. We've been able to use substitute milk, substitute cheeses quite successfully because the flavor is equally good. But I'm deviating, so I'll pause there.
No, that's quite all right. We do have some supplemental information on, a number of people are writing in to say soy might be another allergen, but we do have some content on the site that we will pull up as well and share in the post-webinar resources on elimination diets and what that entails. I do want to stress, if you're going to do an elimination diet, have a nutritionist help you, because it's easy to get undernourish your child if you do that, wing it too much. Yes, very good point. Also along the lines of nutrition, you mentioned omega-3 as an important supplement. Are there others that have been shown to have a positive effect? So many on the market, hard to know what is actually worth the time and investment.
No, for single nutrients, basically no, unless blood levels are low. So if you're concerned about this, ask your pediatrician to check the levels of ferritin, vitamin D, and omega-3. And if those are low, then supplement those. But otherwise, just giving those supplements doesn't seem to do any good all by themselves. Omega-3 is an exception, but even there, we don't know if it's mainly the kids with low blood levels that are showing the response. And I will say that the therapeutic multi-nutrient supplements that I mentioned are now, I think, convincingly beneficial. And so I'll get that information as well to you, Annie, that we can have it up to accompany the slideshow. And I think I think I may have already recommended you to do a whole webinar on that, but we can set that up too.
Okay, everybody, raise your hand if you want a whole webinar. And then another topic of great interest here today was caffeine. You mentioned that can have detrimental effects potentially. Many people wrote in to say that small amounts of caffeine have been beneficial to them or their children. Is there enough evidence to suggest that they should cut out caffeine altogether if it seems to be helping them?
Yeah, great point. And caffeine is such an interesting topic, and I've looked into it at length and written about it a fair amount. The active ingredients in caffeine are clearly beneficial for attention, and work is being done to develop medications based on that without the negative effects of caffeine in coffee or tea. So it's certainly believable to me, and I think I could see where caffeine does help. That's why people drink coffee. I mean, it does help you focus and be alert, and it can help children the same way. The challenge here is that caffeine doses that are safe for children are just unknown. And so too much caffeine can be quite harmful to development, and especially if you're into sports drinks and kind of not tracking the amount of caffeine carefully, it can be quite it's easy just for the child to get too much caffeine. It may be seemingly helping their attention, but it could also be overshooting and making it worse, but could also be hurting their health in other ways while they're still developing. So the best route is to try to avoid the caffeine until they're more fully physically developed in the late teenage years before opening that up. I don't doubt that could be beneficial, but just requires a lot of caution because we don't know the safe dosing range.
Okay, important point. And this one, the impact of trauma we've seen at ADDitude has been just much more widely understood, discussed, appreciated, and especially in the last few years in the context of COVID. And a lot of people here today saying that they feel as though their child's symptoms have exploded in the last 2.5 years. And you spoke a little bit about this, but could you offer next steps for parents who are left wondering, is this trauma, and should we seek, as you said, a different treatment plan for our child, or is this simply ADHD exacerbated by, puberty or just normal child growth?
Yeah, no, this is a really important point. I mean, it's clearly true that the impression that our listeners have is I think probably accurate. I mean, the scientific evidence supports your feeling that kids' problems have gotten a lot worse in the last 2.5, 3 years because we've had so much factors going on at once that are stressing out kids and families. And COVID is the kind of leading edge of that. But of course, we've got a number of other things going on as well in our society that are adding stressors to families and to adults that kids pick up on. But isolation from peers, not being able to go to school, increased conflict at home as a result of everybody being at home all the time. All these are factors. And there's two things to think about here. One is, are you really dealing with kind of a chronic stressful situation? So it's not truly traumatic, but it's chronically stressful. If that's the case, then as you can reduce that chronic stress, the behavior should go back to baseline. However, if you can't reduce that stress, which of course many of us can't right now, then it's the compensating factors that you can do to reduce that. That means increasing support for your child through your increased time with them, your increased cognitive coaching of them. Look at how you cope successfully. What do you tell yourself that helps you cope? Help your child use those same tools because they don't have the same ability you do to think of ways to rethink, reframe what they're facing, change their attitude. They don't have that same kind of that same ability to self-actualize that you do. And so you can help them with that by kind of being that for them, being that voice for them. Giving your child a sense of confidence and competence in their life is very important. But that social support, that social relationship, facilitating that is also helpful. If it's a true trauma that, where they're really showing nightmares, flashbacks, avoiding situations that remind them, and so on, those symptoms, or having true panic attacks when exposed to the traumatic event, whatever it may have been, then that's when you really want to get that differential diagnosis and really determine whether you really need to modify the treatment plan to really address that more than the ADHD as the leading problem.
Okay. Let's see. A couple big ones I want to get to. You talked a good deal about lead and how lead exposure can have an impact. So someone wrote in to saying, do you recommend pursuing blood lead testing for children with ADHD? And is there a protocol for detoxing heavy metals? Could this be helpful?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I mean, certainly getting that lead test is probably worth doing, just to make sure you don't have super high exposure. Especially if you live in an area, some communities do have high exposure. Flint, Michigan, some areas in Louisiana. There's various parts of our country where there's still quite a lot of very high lead exposure, and it's worth getting tested to see what your child's level is. However, the problem is that the levels of lead that are now known to be unsafe, we're talking now down to less than 10 parts per billion, are not detectable by the equipment typically used in medical screening of kids. We use special equipment in the scientific laboratory experiments to detect these low levels and accurately measure them. So you may very well get a response from the lab that there's no detectable level of lead in your blood, but their minimum detectable level is not low enough to pick up the relevant variation of lead. So I think getting the testing is certainly worth it to make sure there's not super high levels, but often will be uninformative and will leave you still wondering. And then it's a matter of really looking at, well, what's the lead content in our water? What's the lead content in our air? You can buy relatively cheap detectors to look at those things. Same for the school. The school water, obviously water supply in schools has been in the media a lot the last few years and is a big concern. For detoxing lead for kids, I think unless the lead is so high that the child is physically sick, if the child's not physically sick from the lead, then I wouldn't pursue the chemical detox. It's kind of like giving your child chemotherapy to detox from lead, and it's the treatment itself is so dangerous, it's not worth it. It's better to avoid ongoing exposure and work on other ameliorative actions. Healthy diet, vitamin D and other vitamins and nutrients, our iron, making sure iron is adequate. These things can help minimize the effects of lead actually quite a bit because of the way lead is metabolized in the body. Vitamin D and iron in particular are important. And this might be part of why low levels of vitamin D and iron, or specifically ferritin, are also being associated. So best thing to do is to work on reducing lead exposure through the school and through the home as best you can, and improve that healthy diet, and definitely rule out high exposure if you see physical symptoms. Your pediatrician, though, should be able to tell you if that's possible from your child's physical health, and probably follow a pediatric recommendation on whether the testing is going to be worth it.
Okay, great. Now, we mentioned at the outset here, and you mentioned that some of the resources today came from your book, Getting Ahead of ADHD. Parents are wondering if you have other recommendations for reading materials that can help them with next steps.
Yes, there certainly are a lot of good ones right now. It really depends on the particular area you want to look into. For example, there's several very good self-help books for parents to manage ADHD. Russ Barkley's book for parents, Getting Ahead of ADHD, or Getting a Handle on ADHD, is a very helpful starting point for the parenting side of this. I think for the environmental toxicants, I do think the EPA website is not a bad place to start, although it does take some digging and poking around there to find what you need. There's many environmental advocacy groups that distribute. Here in Oregon, we have a group called the environmental group that distributes stuff on their webpage for reducing pollutant and toxicant exposure. So your local state probably has a Physicians for Social Responsibility group or another kind of environmental advocacy group that may have material on their website for household cleaners, household chemicals, and managing that kind of stuff. For diet, very tricky. There's a major book out recently. I'll get a couple of these resources to you, Annie, and again we can add them to the notes for the slideshow.
Perfect. Perfect. So unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Nigg. This was incredibly informative. We appreciate your expertise and your time today. And thank you to everyone in the ADDitude community who joined us today. We hope you'll come back, where our next webinar will be about specifically digital therapeutics for ADHD. So if you have an interest in that, we hope you will join us. And as always, you can visit ADDitudeMag.com to get updated on upcoming webinars, as well as our latest articles and research updates. Thank you again, Dr. Nigg, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon.